The 347 to San Francisco was her escape from everything that had gone wrong in her life. Steam hissed from the black locomotive like an angry beast, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the crowded railway platform. Evangeline Sterling clutched her worn leather suitcase tighter as she pushed through the mass of travelers, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. 3 years of running, 3 years of looking over her shoulder, and finally she had enough money saved to disappear completely into the big city where no one would ever find her. The train whistle screamed its warning, sharp and urgent. Eva quickened her pace, her boot heels clicking against the wooden planks of the depot floor. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool October air. She could hear the conductor's voice booming over the noise of the crowd, calling for final boarding. This was it. This was her chance to leave everything behind forever. The nightmare that started in that dusty courthouse 3 years ago would finally be over. She was only 50 feet from the train car steps when a voice cut through the station noise like a blade through silk. Low, calm, and impossibly familiar, though she'd never heard it before in her life. Your journey ends here with me. Eva stopped so suddenly that the man behind her nearly knocked her over. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. Slowly, she turned around to face the speaker, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped her suitcase. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair that looked like he'd been riding hard in the wind. His clothes were simple, dark pants, white shirt, and a brown leather vest that had seen better days. A cowboy hat sat low on his head, shadowing his eyes, but she could feel his gaze on her like a physical touch. He stood completely still in the chaos of the depot, as if he had all the time in the world while her entire future hung in the balance. "I'm sorry," Eva managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think you have me confused with someone else." The man stepped closer, and now she could see his eyes clearly. They were the color of storm clouds, gray with flecks of blue, and they looked right through her carefully constructed lies. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but firm, like he was talking to a spooked horse. "No confusion here. Miss Evangeline Claire Morrison, though I hear you've been going by Sterling these days." The sound of her real name hit her like a physical blow. She actually took a step backward, her free hand flying to her throat. Morrison. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 3 years. It was the name that could get her killed. The name she'd buried so deep, she sometimes forgot it herself in the dark hours before dawn. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, but even she could hear how weak her words sounded. The train whistle blew again, longer this time, more insistent. She could hear the great wheels beginning to turn, metal grinding against metal. Her escape was literally moving away from her, and she stood frozen like a deer in rifle sights. "You're not running from them anymore, Eva," the stranger said, using the shortened version of her name like they were old friends. "You're running from the truth." "The truth." She let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. "The truth is that my father is dead, and if I stay in this godforsaken territory one more day, I'll be dead too. So whoever you are, whatever you want, you're too late. Your father isn't dead." 4 simple words that turned her entire world upside down. Eva felt the depot floor shift beneath her feet like she was on the deck of a ship in a storm. The noise of the crowd faded to a distant buzz, and all she could hear was the thundering of her own heartbeat in her ears. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I saw the telegram. I saw the grave marker. Thomas Morrison died 2 years ago in a mining accident in Colorado. The cowboy, because that's what he had to be with those weathered hands and sun-darkened skin, shook his head slowly. Thomas Morrison had to die so the real killers would stop hunting him. But he's very much alive, Miss Morrison, and he sent me to find you." The train was definitely moving now. Eva could see it pulling away from the platform, carrying with it her carefully planned future. Her ticket to freedom was disappearing into the distance, but she couldn't seem to make her feet move. She stared at this stranger who claimed to know impossible things about her life, about her father, about secrets she thought were buried deeper than any grave. "Who are you?" she asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. "Name's Rafe Caldwell. I'm a U.S. Marshal, and I've been looking for you for 6 months." He reached slowly into his vest pocket and pulled out a battered tin star. The late afternoon sun caught it and threw tiny rainbows across his chest. "Your father hired me to find you and bring you to him. He's got something important to tell you. Something about the night Judge Crawford died. Judge Crawford, the man whose murder had destroyed her family, whose blood she could still see in her nightmares. The reason she'd been running for 3 years, the reason she'd changed her name and learned to sleep with a gun under a pillow. At the mention of his name, every carefully built wall around her memories came crashing down. Eva's suitcase slipped from her numb fingers and hit the depot floor with a solid thunk. Inside, she could hear the glass picture frame of her mother breaking, the only photograph she had left of her family from before everything went wrong. The sound seemed to wake her from her trance, and she looked up to see the last car of the San Francisco train disappearing around a bend in the tracks. Her escape was gone. Her carefully saved money was worthless paper in her reticule. And this stranger with the storm gray eyes was offering her something she'd given up hoping for 3 years ago. The truth about what really happened that terrible night. "If you're lying to me," she said, her voice stronger now, "if this is some kind of trick to get me to lower my guard, I want you to know that I'm not the same scared girl who ran away from home. I've learned to take care of myself." Rafe Caldwell tipped his hat to her, and for the first time since he'd spoken her name, he smiled. It transformed his whole face, making him look younger and far less dangerous. "Ma'am, I'm counting on that, because where we're going, you're going to need every bit of that strength you've built up. The men who want you dead, they want your father dead too, and they don't know yet that you're both still breathing." Rafe Caldwell guided Eva away from the depot with a firm hand on her elbow, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd around them. She noticed how he moved, like a man who'd spent years expecting trouble to come from any direction. Every few steps, he'd glance over his shoulder or check the shadows between buildings. It made her stomach twist with a familiar fear she'd hoped to leave behind on that train. "Where exactly are we going, Marshal Caldwell?" Eva asked, trying to keep her voice steady as they walked down the main street of a dusty railroad town. The sun was getting lower, painting everything in shades of gold and orange, but she barely noticed the beauty of it. Her mind was still reeling from everything he'd told her. "Somewhere we can talk without half the territory listening in," he replied, steering her toward a modest hotel at the end of the block. "And call me Rafe. If we're going to be traveling together, we might as well drop the formalities." The hotel lobby was small and dimly lit, with faded red wallpaper and furniture that had seen better days. Rafe approached the desk clerk, a thin man with nervous eyes who kept wiping his hands on a dirty apron. "2 rooms," Rafe said quietly, placing a silver coin on the scarred wooden counter. "Back of the building, if you have them. And we weren't here if anyone comes asking." The clerk's eyes widened slightly, but he took the money and handed over 2 keys without question. Eva noticed that Rafe had asked for separate rooms, and despite everything, she felt a small flutter of relief. She might be desperate for answers, but she wasn't completely naive about the dangers of trusting a stranger. Their rooms were on the 2nd floor, connected by a thin wall that probably wouldn't muffle much conversation. Rafe unlocked her door first and stepped inside to check the space. Looking behind the curtains, testing the window latch, even glancing under the narrow bed. Only when he was satisfied did he hand her the key. "Get settled," he said. "I'll be back in 10 minutes, and then we need to talk. Really talk." Eva sat on the edge of the bed after he left, her hands folded in her lap to stop them from shaking. The broken suitcase sat at her feet, and she could see fragments of glass from her mother's photograph glinting in the lamplight. 3 years of careful planning, 3 years of saving every penny, and it had all come apart in the space of 5 minutes because of one man's impossible claim. When Rafe knocked on her door, she almost didn't answer. Part of her wanted to climb out the window and disappear into the gathering darkness. But the larger part of her, the part that had been carrying the weight of unanswered questions for 3 long years, couldn't walk away from the possibility that her father was alive. "You want to know about Judge Crawford?" Rafe said without preamble as soon as she let him in. He'd removed his hat, and she could see that his dark hair was touched with gray at the temples. It made him look older, more serious. "You want to know why your father had to disappear? Why you've been running? Why those men are still hunting you?" "I know why," Eva said, but her voice lacked conviction. "My father killed Judge Crawford during a card game. It was in all the newspapers. There were witnesses." Rafe shook his head and pulled a wooden chair away from the small table by the window. When he sat down, his gray eyes never left her face. "Your father never played cards with Judge Crawford. He was 30 miles away that night, meeting with me and 2 other marshals about a land fraud case we'd been building for months." Eva felt her breath catch in her throat. "That's impossible. The witnesses saw him. They testified in court." "The witnesses were paid to lie," Rafe said simply. Judge Crawford was getting too close to exposing a group of men who'd been stealing land from small farmers and selling it to the railroad companies. "Your father was helping us gather evidence against them. Crawford was killed to shut him up, and your father was framed to keep him from testifying about what he knew." The room seemed to spin around Eva. She gripped the edge of the bed to steady herself. "You're saying my father was innocent? All this time, all these years of running and hiding and being afraid." "He's been hiding too," Rafe said gently. "The men behind the judge's murder put a bounty on his head, dead or alive. They figured if they couldn't frame him properly, they'd just make sure he couldn't talk at all. When he heard they were coming for you too, he knew he had to disappear completely." "But the mining accident," Eva whispered. "The telegram said he was killed in a cave-in. We staged it, made it look like Thomas Morrison died, so the Rayall killers would stop looking for him. He's been living under a different name in the mountains, gathering more evidence, trying to build a case strong enough to clear his name and bring you home." Eva stood up abruptly and walked to the window. The street below was mostly empty now, just a few late travelers hurrying toward their destinations. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and tried to make sense of everything Rafe was telling her. "Why should I believe you?" she asked without turning around. "How do I know this isn't some elaborate trap? How do I know you're not working for the same men who killed the judge?" She heard the chair creak as Rafe stood up, but he didn't come closer. "Because, Miss Morrison, if I was working for them, you'd already be dead. They don't want you alive to testify about what you saw that night. They want you buried next to Judge Crawford." The words hit her like a physical blow. Eva turned around slowly, and what she saw in Rafe's face made her blood run cold. He wasn't just telling her about danger in the abstract. He was warning her about something immediate and real. "They know I'm here," she said, and it wasn't a question. "They've been tracking you for weeks. The only reason you made it this far is because you're smarter than they gave you credit for." Rafe moved to the window and peered down at the street. "But they're close now. Too close." As if summoned by his words, the sound of horses' hooves echoed up from the street below. Eva joined him at the window and saw 3 men dismounting in front of the hotel. Even in the dim light of the street lamps, she could see the guns on their hips and the hard set of their faces. "We need to go," Rafe said quietly, reaching for his hat. "Right now." Eva's heart started pounding again, but this time it wasn't from fear alone. There was something else mixed in, a strange sense of relief. For 3 years, she'd been running from shadows, jumping at every unexpected sound, never knowing when her past would catch up to her. Now it was here, real and solid and facing her down. Somehow, that was almost better than the constant wondering. "There's a back staircase," she said, surprising herself with how calm her voice sounded. "I saw it when we came up. It leads to the alley behind the kitchen." Rafe looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Good eye. Can you shoot?" Eva reached into her reticule and pulled out a small derringer. its pearl handles smooth from years of worried touching. I learned to take care of myself, remember? Then let's go meet your father, Rafe said, and there was something in his smile that made her think maybe, just maybe, she found someone she could trust. The sound of heavy boots on the hotel stairs echoed through the thin walls, and Eva knew that her 3 years of running were about to become something very different. Something that looked a lot like fighting back. The back staircase creaked under their weight as Eva and Rafe made their way down through the darkness. She could hear voices in the hotel lobby now, rough and demanding, asking the nervous clerk about guests who'd checked in recently. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hand was steady on the derringer. 3 years of looking over her shoulder had taught her to stay calm when danger was breathing down her neck. Rafe moved like a cat in front of her, each step silent and deliberate. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, he held up his hand for her to stop while he peered around the corner into the alley. The narrow space behind the hotel was filled with shadows and the smell of garbage from the kitchen, but it was empty of people. 2 horses, he whispered, pointing to where a pair of saddled mounts stood tied to a hitching post near the back door. I came prepared for a quick exit. Eva couldn't help but be impressed. You really are a marshal. 20 years of chasing bad men teaches you to plan for the worst, he replied, untying the reins of a gentle-looking mare. Can you ride? Instead of answering, Eva gathered her skirts and swung up into the saddle with the easy grace of someone who'd grown up on horseback. Rafe's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and she allowed herself a small smile despite their dangerous situation. I wasn't always a city girl running from my past, she said. My father taught me to ride before I could properly walk. The sound of boots thundering down the main staircase inside the hotel cut their conversation short. Rafe mounted his horse, a big black gelding that looked like it could run all day, and they spurred their animals toward the mouth of the alley. Which way? Eva asked as they reached the street. North, Rafe said. Into the hills. There's an old mining camp about 15 miles from here, where we can rest and figure out our next move. They rode hard through the darkening streets, the sound of their horses' hooves echoing off the wooden buildings. Behind them, Eva could hear shouts and the crash of doors being kicked open as the men searched the hotel. By the time their pursuers realized they'd flown the coop, she and Rafe were already at the edge of town, disappearing into the rolling landscape beyond. The moon was rising, casting silver light across the scrubland and making the distant mountains look like sleeping giants. Eva had forgotten how beautiful the open country could be at night, how the air smelled of sage and freedom instead of fear and confinement. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like she could breathe deeply. They rode in silence for the first hour, both of them listening for the sound of pursuit. But gradually, as the miles fell away behind them and no one appeared on their trail, Eva began to relax in the saddle. That's when the questions that had been building up inside her finally spilled out. Tell me about my father, she said as they slowed their horses to a steady walk. Is he well? Rafe glanced over at her, his face thoughtful in the moonlight. He's older, more weathered. Living in hiding hasn't been easy on him. But he's tough as old leather, just like his daughter apparently. What do you mean? Most women in your situation would have fallen apart by now. 3 years of running, constantly looking over your shoulder, never knowing who to trust. But here you are, calm as can be, riding through dangerous country with a man you met a few hours ago. He shook his head with something that looked like admiration. Your father said you were special, but I didn't expect this. Eva felt a flush of warmth at his words, but she kept her voice steady. I had good teachers. Fear and necessity can make a person learn things they never thought they'd need to know. Like shooting, she patted the derringer in her pocket. Among other things, I can also pick locks, disappear into a crowd, and sleep with one eye open. Not exactly ladle-like accomplishments, but they've kept me alive. Where did you learn to pick locks? Eva was quiet for a moment, remembering. There was a woman in Kansas City who took me in for a while. She'd had a hard life too, and she taught me that sometimes a woman has to bend the rules to survive. She said proper ladies die young and poor, but clever women find ways to make their own luck. Rafe chuckled, a low, warm sound in the darkness. I think I would have liked this woman. She would have liked you too. She always said the best men were the ones who treated women like partners instead of fragile flowers. Eva glanced at him sideways. Is that why my father chose you to find me? Because you don't think women are helpless? That's part of it. But mostly he chose me because I owe him my life. The simple statement hung in the air between them like a challenge. Eva waited, sensing there was more to the story. It was about 5 years ago. Rafe continued after a moment. I was tracking a gang of cattle rustlers up in Colorado. Got myself cornered in a box canyon with no way out. 3 of them, one of me, and my horse had taken a bullet. I figured I was done for. What happened? Your father came out of nowhere with a rifle and the best aim I've ever seen. Dropped 2 of the rustlers clean, wounded the 3rd enough that he surrendered without a fight. Turned out Thomas had been tracking the same gang because they'd stolen cattle from some of the small farmers he was trying to help. Eva felt her throat tighten with emotion. That sounded exactly like the father she remembered, always willing to help someone in trouble, even if it meant putting himself at risk. We spent 3 days tracking down the rest of the gang together, Rafe went on. By the time we were done, I knew I'd found the most honorable man I'd ever met. When he contacted me about finding you, there was no question I'd help him. They were climbing into the foothills now, following a narrow trail that wound between stands of pine and aspen. The air was cooler here, crisp with the promise of winter, and Eva pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Are you cold? Rafe asked, noticing her shiver. A little, but I'm fine. He reined in his horse and began unfastening his coat. Take this. I don't need. Take it, he said firmly, holding out the heavy wool garment. We've got hours of riding ahead of us, and you won't be any good to your father if you freeze to death before we get there. Eva accepted the coat, trying not to notice how it smelled like leather and soap and something distinctly masculine. When she put it on, it was still warm from his body, and she had to resist the urge to bury her face in the collar. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't mention it. They rode on through the night, and gradually Eva found herself telling Rafe things she'd never told anyone. About the nightmares that still woke her up screaming. About the loneliness of never being able to make real friends because she couldn't risk getting close to people. About the guilt she carried for running away instead of staying to fight for her father's innocence. You were 18 years old and scared, Rafe said when she finished. You did what you had to do to survive. Your father doesn't blame you for that. How can you be sure? Because every letter he sent me for the past 6 months has started the same way. Have you found my daughter yet? Is she safe? Rafe's voice was gentle in the darkness. That man has thought of nothing but getting you back safely. He's proud of how strong you've become, not angry that you ran. By the time they reached the abandoned mining camp, Eva was exhausted but strangely hopeful. The camp was nothing more than a few tumble-down shacks and the dark mouth of a played-out mine, but it offered shelter and concealment. Rafe built a small fire in the ruins of what had once been the camp's main building, and they shared jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. How much farther to my father? Eva asked as they sat by the flickering flames. 2 days hard riding. He's holed up in an old trapper's cabin near the Continental Divide. Remote enough that no one's likely to stumble across him by accident. Eva nodded and stared into the fire, thinking about the reunion she'd dreamed of and feared in equal measure. What if he doesn't recognize me? I've changed so much. He'll recognize you, Rafe said with certainty. You've got his eyes and his stubborn streak. She laughed despite herself. Is that supposed to be a compliment? From a man who spent the last 20 years dealing with stubborn people, yes. Their eyes met across the fire, and Eva felt something shift in the air between them. Something warm and dangerous and entirely unexpected. For a moment, she forgot about everything else The men chasing them, the uncertainty ahead, even her father waiting in the mountains. There's only Rafe's storm gray eyes and the way he was looking at her like she was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. Then a sound in the darkness outside made them both freeze, the soft whinny of a horse that wasn't one of theirs. "We're not alone," Rafe whispered, his hand moving to his gun. Eva's hope crumbled as she realized their pursuers had found them again. Somehow, despite all their careful planning and hard riding, they were still being hunted. And now she had to wonder, who else knew where they were going? Rafe motioned for Eva to stay low as he crept toward the edge of their shelter. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see the tension in his shoulders. Eva gripped her derringer, her heart pounding as she listened for any sound that would tell them how many men were out there. A voice called out from the darkness, friendly and familiar. "Rafe? Rafe Caldwell? It's Marshall Dixon. We've been tracking you for hours, son." Eva saw Rafe's shoulders relax slightly. "Tom Dixon," he said quietly to her. "Another Marshall. We've worked together before." He raised his voice. "Come on in, Tom. But come slow and keep your hand where I can see them." An older man stepped into the firelight, his marshal's badge glinting on his vest. He had gray hair and kind eyes, and he smiled when he saw Eva. "Miss Morrison, I presume? Your father's been worried sick about you. How did you find us?" Rafe asked, but his tone was easy now, relieved. "Tracked you from the hotel. Those men who were after you split up. Some went west, some went east. I followed the smart ones." Dixon tied his horse next to theirs and warmed his hands over the dying fire. "Thomas sent me to help. Figured you might need backup getting his daughter to safety." Eva felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Another lawman meant better odds against whoever was chasing them. "Is my father well?" "Champing at the bit to see you, miss. He's got everything ready. Evidence, witnesses, enough proof to clear his name and put the Rayall killers behind bars." Dixon pulled out a piece of paper from his coat. "He sent this letter for you." Eva's hand shook as she took the folded paper. The handwriting was definitely her father's, though more shaky than she remembered. "My dearest daughter," it began, "if you're reading this, then Rafe has found you and you know the truth. I've missed you every day for 3 years. Come home to me." Tears blurred her vision. After all this time, all the fear and loneliness, she was finally going to see her father again. "We should move at first light," Dixon said. "The men tracking you aren't giving up easy, but I know shortcuts through the mountains. We can reach Thomas by tomorrow evening." They settled down to rest, taking turns keeping watch. Eva felt safer than she had in years with 2 experienced marshals protecting her. When Rafe woke her for the second watch, his hand lingered on her shoulder longer than necessary. "Everything's going to be fine now," he whispered. "You'll be with your father soon." The next morning dawned clear and cold. They rode hard through mountain passes Eva had never seen before, following game trails that Dixon seemed to know by heart. The older marshal was a good storyteller, and he kept her entertained with tales of her father's adventures over the past few years. "Thomas has been like a ghost in these mountains," Dixon said as they stopped to water their horses at a creek. "Always one step ahead of trouble, always gathering more evidence. He's built an airtight case against the men who killed Judge Crawford." By afternoon, they were riding through a narrow canyon with high stone walls on both sides. Eva was thinking about what she would say to her father when they were reunited, when Dixon suddenly reined in his horse. "This is it," he said. "The cabin's just around that bend." But something was wrong. Eva could see it in the way Rafe had gone completely still, his hand moving slowly toward his gun. The canyon was too quiet, and Dixon was smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "You know, Miss Morrison," Dixon said conversationally, "your father was always too trusting, always believed the best in people, even when he shouldn't have." "Tom," Rafe said quietly, "what are you doing?" "Well, I've been paid very well to do for the past 5 years." Dixon's friendly mask slipped away completely. "The men you've been running from? They've had a marshal on their payroll all along." "Me." Eva's blood turned to ice. The letter from her father, it was a fake. The shortcuts through the mountains, they were leading her straight into a trap. Rafe's gun was halfway out of its holster when Dixon's shot echoed through the canyon. Rafe jerked in his saddle and tumbled to the ground, blood spreading across his shirt. "No!" Eva screamed, but before she could reach him, more men appeared on the canyon walls above them. At least 6 rifles pointed down at her, and she knew that one wrong move would mean death. "Don't worry about Rafe," Dixon said, dismounting to check on the fallen marshal. "I'm a good shot. He'll live long enough to watch what happens to you. Then we'll finish him off." Eva stared down at Rafe's still form, rage building inside her like a wildfire. For 3 years, she'd run from these men. She'd lived in fear, never staying in one place long enough to build a real life. And now they'd used her own father against her, used her love for him to lead her into this trap. But as she looked at the rifles pointed at her from above, something strange happened. The fear that had controlled her life for so long simply disappeared. Maybe it was seeing Rafe shot down like a dog. Maybe it was realizing that her father was probably already dead. Maybe it was just that she was tired of being afraid. "You made one mistake, Dixon," she said, her voice steady as stone. "What's that, little girl?" Eva smiled, and it was not a nice smile. "You assumed I'd come quietly." Before anyone could react, she threw herself sideways off her horse, rolled behind a boulder, and came up shooting. Her first shot took one of the riflemen off the canyon wall. Her second shot made the others dive for cover. The scared girl who'd run from home 3 years ago was gone. In her place was a woman who'd learned that sometimes the only way to stop running was to turn around and fight. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around Eva as she crouched behind the boulder, her mind working faster than it ever had before. 6 men on the canyon walls, Dixon somewhere behind her, and Rafe bleeding on the ground. The odds were impossible, but she'd spent 3 years learning that impossible didn't mean hopeless. She checked her derringer. 4 shots left. Not nearly enough. But Rafe's gun had fallen just 10 feet away when he went down. If she could reach it without getting herself killed, she might have a chance. "Give it up, girl," Dixon shouted from across the canyon floor. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Make this easy on yourself." Eva didn't answer. Instead, she picked up a good-sized rock and hurled it toward the opposite wall. When the men above shifted their aim toward the sound, she rolled out from behind her cover and dove for Rafe's gun. A bullet burned across her shoulder as she grabbed the weapon, but she managed to get back to cover with Rafe's Colt revolver in her hand. 6 shots plus her 4, she could work with that. That's when she heard it, a low groan from where Rafe had fallen. He was alive, and he was trying to say something. "Eva," his voice was barely a whisper, but she heard it clearly in the sudden quiet. "Your father, he's not at the cabin." "Where is he?" she called back, keeping low as another volley of shots peppered her hiding spot. "Safe house behind the old church in Clearwater." Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort. "Dixon doesn't know." Eva's heart leaped. Her father was alive, and he was somewhere these men couldn't find him. That meant she wasn't just fighting for her own life anymore. She was fighting to get back to the only family she had left. She waited for the next lull in the shooting, then made her move. Rolling to her left, she came up behind a different boulder and put a bullet through the hat of one of the riflemen. He ducked down, cursing loudly. "She's moving," Dixon yelled. "Don't let her get away." But Eva wasn't trying to get away anymore. She was hunting, using the rocks and shadows like she'd learned to use crowds and doorways in the city. She worked her way around the canyon floor. Every shot she fired made the men above more nervous, more likely to make mistakes. When one of them exposed himself too long while trying to get a better angle, she made him pay for it. 20 minutes later, only 3 riflemen remained on the canyon walls, and Dixon was starting to sound worried. "This is your last chance, Morrison," he called out. "Surrender now, and I'll make it quick." Eva's answer was a bullet that came so close to his head, it dove face first into the dirt. While he was down, She sprinted across the open ground to where Rafe lay. The marshal was pale and bleeding, but his eyes were alert. "Thought you were supposed to be the one getting rescued," he whispered with a weak smile. "Plans change," Eva said, quickly checking his wound. The bullet had gone through his shoulder. Painful, but not fatal if they could stop the bleeding. "Can you ride? If you can get me to my horse." Eva looked around the canyon. Two men were still shooting at them from above, and Dixon was somewhere behind a cluster of rocks about 50 yards away. Their horses were another 30 yards beyond that, right out in the open. "I need you to trust me," she said to Rafe. "When I say run, you head for the horses as fast as you can. Don't look back. What about you?" Eva smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, it was the smile of someone who wasn't afraid. "I'm going to end this." She helped Rafe to his feet, then suddenly stood up in full view of everyone in the canyon. "Dixon," she shouted, "I want to make a deal. I'm listening. Me for him. Let Rafe go, and I'll come quietly." Dixon laughed. "You're in no position to make deals, girl." "Actually, I am." Eva pulled something from her pocket, a small leather journal she'd been carrying for 3 years. "Because I've got Judge Crawford's real diary, the one with all the names in it, including yours." The canyon went completely silent. "That's impossible," Dixon said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "The judge gave it to me the night he died, right before your friends shot him. Every name, every payoff, every piece of land that was stolen. It's all here." She held the journal high. "Shoot me, and this goes to the territorial governor. Let us go, and maybe I'll consider keeping quiet." It was a bluff. The journal contained nothing but her own thoughts and fears from the past 3 years. But Dixon didn't know that. "Run," she whispered to Rafe. As the wounded marshals stumbled toward the horses, Eva kept talking, spinning a story about evidence and witnesses that would send Dixon and his friends to the gallows. Some of it was lies, but some of it was the truth she'd been carrying in her heart. When Dixon finally realized he'd been had and came charging across the canyon with his gun drawn, Eva was ready for him. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12 years old, and she'd never forgotten his lessons. Dixon's gun never cleared its holster. The remaining men on the canyon walls, seeing their leader dead and their position hopeless, threw down their weapons and called for mercy. Eva kept them covered while Rafe managed to get the horses ready. As they rode away from the canyon, leaving the surviving gunmen tied up with their own rope, Eva finally allowed herself to believe it was over. "How did you know about the diary?" Rafe asked as they headed toward Clearwater. Eva smiled and patted her pocket. "Sometimes the best lies are the ones people want to believe." The old church in Clearwater sat at the edge of town, its white paint peeling and bell tower crooked with age. Eva's hands trembled as she and Rafe approached the small building behind it, barely more than a cabin really. 3 years of dreaming about this moment, and now she wasn't sure she was ready. "He's in there," Rafe said softly, his arm in a makeshift sling, but his voice steady. "Your father's in there, Eva." She took a deep breath and knocked on the wooden door. Footsteps shuffled inside, slow and careful. When the door opened, Eva's breath caught in her throat. Thomas Morrison had aged more than the 3 years they'd been apart. His hair was completely gray now, and new lines mapped the worry and pain across his face. But his eyes, those were exactly the same warm brown eyes that had read her bedtime stories and taught her to ride. "Evangeline," his voice broke on her name. "My little girl." "I'm here, Papa," she whispered, and then she was in his arms, both of them crying like their hearts would break. They held each other for a long time while Rafe waited quietly outside. When they finally broke apart, Thomas kept his hands on her shoulders as if he was afraid she might disappear again. "Let me look at you," he said, studying her face. "You're so grown up, so strong. I can see in your eyes. You're not the scared girl who ran away anymore." "I had to learn to take care of myself," Eva said, wiping away tears. "But I never stopped missing you. I never stopped hoping this day would come." Over the next hour, the whole truth finally came out. Thomas showed her the evidence he'd been gathering, documents proving the land fraud, testimonies from witnesses, even a signed confession from one of Judge Crawford's real killers who'd grown a conscience. The conspiracy had been bigger than Eva ever imagined, involving railroad money and corrupt officials all the way up to the territorial capital. "It's over now," Thomas said, holding up a telegram that had arrived that morning. "The territorial governor has issued pardons for both of us. The Real killers are in custody, and our names are cleared." Eva felt a weight she'd carried for 3 years finally lift from her shoulders. "We're free, completely free. We can go anywhere, do anything. Start over wherever you want." That's when Rafe appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to say goodbye before I head back to Denver." Eva's heart sank. In all the excitement of reuniting with her father, she'd pushed aside the growing feelings she had for the marshal who'd saved her life. "You're leaving? My job here is done. You're safe, your father's cleared, and the criminals are caught." He managed a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Besides, you've got your whole life ahead of you now. You can go to San Francisco like you planned. See the world. Do anything you want. What if what I want isn't what I planned 3 years ago?" Eva asked quietly. Rafe looked at her for a long moment, and she saw hope flicker in those storm-gray eyes. "What are you saying?" Eva looked at her father, who was watching them both with the knowing smile of a man who'd seen this coming from miles away. "I'm saying that sometimes the end of one journey is the beginning of another." She stepped closer to Rafe, close enough to see the surprise and wonder in his expression. "I'm saying that I spent 3 years running away from everything, and I'm tired of running. I want to build something instead, with someone I trust. She took a breath. "Someone I love." "Eva," Rafe said softly, reaching out to touch her face. "Are you sure? You can have any life you want now." "This is the life I want," she said firmly. "If you'll have me as a partner. In everything." Instead of answering with words, Rafe kissed her. It was soft and sweet and full of all the promises they hadn't dared to make before. When they broke apart, Thomas was chuckling behind them. "I take it I should start planning a wedding?" he asked. 6 months later, Eva stood in that same depot where everything had begun, but now she wore a simple gold band on her finger and Rafe's arm around her waist. They were waiting for a train, but not to escape this time. They were heading home after their honeymoon in Denver, back to the small house they'd built together on the outskirts of Clearwater. The house where Eva had started a business helping women in trouble. Women like she'd once been, who needed safe passage or a place to hide, or just someone who understood what it felt like to be afraid and alone. Rafe had resigned his marshal position to work with her, using his law enforcement connections to make their underground railroad for desperate women even more effective. As they watched the train approach, Eva thought about the scared girl who tried to board a different train in this same spot not so long ago. That girl had been running from her past, convinced that escape was her only option. But sometimes the bravest thing you could do wasn't run away. Sometimes it was stay and fight for what mattered. "Any regrets?" Rafe asked, as if he could read her thoughts. Eva smiled and stood on her tiptoes to kiss her husband. "Not a single one. Some journeys in exactly where they're supposed to begin." The train whistle blew, but this time it didn't sound like a call to escape. It sounded like a promise that whatever adventures lay ahead, they'd face them together. And as they climbed aboard to head home to their new life, Eva knew that the best part of her story was just beginning.